Welcome into another episode of My Strange Bible here with me, my boy Al. What's up, Al? You doing all right?
I am doing just fine, Steve. How are you, sir?
Man, in this episode, I'm so pumped because guess what? I'm so excited. We're going to be talking about what so many people have called one of the strangest passages in the entire Bible. And since this podcast is called My Strange Bible, I figure it's the perfect place.
I am just as excited for this because I don't really know what the heck we're talking about tonight, Steve. So, some background for some people. Steve and I were talking today about what to do for episodes tonight, and Steve said, "Hey, really excited about a sermon that I did a week or so ago." So he basically said we're going to do that, and so I'm kind of on for the joyride here, and I will be swept along with everyone listening as well. So, Steve, we are in. You captivate our minds here.
Well,
That's a high charge.
this is probably a 2.5 hour long sermon that I had to compress the other Sunday night into about 30 minutes. And
Nice.
at our church, everyone is very, very patient with me. I'm just a member of our teaching team. I'm not a pastor there. So everybody is really patient with me. And they kind of know me as the lay pastor of theology and apologetics. And so they know whenever I preach or teach that it's time to put the thinking cap on. But it's exciting because I feel like at our church, there's a lot of people who really hunger for the word and hunger for content. And so passages like this need not scare us, need not confuse us. They're very strange. This is a weird one. I'm telling you right now. We're probably going to make this probably about a 3-part series. So this is going to take up the next few episodes, but hang with us. There's some really cool nuggets in this story, and I'm just excited to dive in. So any questions, Alex, before we kind of let this train loose?
No questions. Let's let it loose. Let's see where it takes us.
All right. So here's what I want to do. I want to start out with an excerpt. It's a long excerpt, but I'm going to read it. And it's from a book called The Paradise King. Now, this is a fantastic book that was written by Blaine Eldridge. If you've ever read any of the work of John Eldridge, he's a pastor, I believe, out in the Midwest. He's written a lot of great books like Wild at Heart and Desire and many others. But Blaine Eldridge is a fantastic writer. He's I think he's an English person, whatever, a scholar of the English language, if you will, or just a languages scholar in general. And so, and you can tell just by the way that his writing is. So what we want to do is sort of, first of all, set up the context for where we're at in the book of Judges. All right. So this excerpt from the book is sort of like an interlude that is meant to take you from Moses and the work that he did to David and the work that he did. So this is sort of bridging the gap between Moses and David. So here we go. Quote, "Then came wartime. The people keened their swords. They made weapons of plowshares. The waters of the Jordan piled up, and Israel entered Canaan. Joshua led them, and the wild lion Caleb was with him. Like a storm, they entered the land. Like a river in spring, they flooded the country. Some towns they burned, others they spared. Swiftly they moved, for time was not on their side. Joshua divided the tribes. He issued his orders. Quickly, they sought out the opponents Yahweh prescribed. Harem, a ban, a thing set apart. That is the term for Joshua's wars. It is not in itself a bloodthirsty word. An Israelite could give God a field. That field would be harem too. Many things could be set aside for Yahweh. In the wars, it meant giving something over completely. Who was under that ban? Anakim, Rephaim, Martu. These were giants. Israel knew giants already. They had slain the witch kings, Sihon and Og was the last of the Rephaim. His unclean spirit lingered long afterward. But in Canaan, there were Anakim. There were others from Bashan. There were many clans who knew the rituals and the methods of false incarnation the flood had destroyed. Their towns were harem, and they were burned even until the stones cracked. In many places, only ashes remained, or should have. Israel did not succeed. Manasseh did not drive out the occupants of Beth Shean. Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites. Zebulun did not drive out the occupants of Kitron. The list is long. Asher, Naphtali, Dan, these also abandoned the work. And so many giants and many priests and many sibilant servants remained. They stayed in Canaan like venomous spores, hiding unclean partnerships, spreading rebellion, whispering to ghosts, spirits. Their masters also remained, in hiding at first, but in daylight afterward. Oh, it seemed hopeful for a while. At Bethel, they set up the tabernacle. The angel of the Lord, who had led them from Egypt, was often seen. Visions were not rare. Joshua made war with the Shadu chieftains a long time. He crossed the Jordan and took the land and split it up and served the Lord. Even so, before he died, he knew disaster was coming. When he set up an altar, he saw this. He renewed the covenant, and yet he could tell. Choose today, he said, who you will serve. As for me and my household, we will serve Yahweh. We will also, the people replied. Yet as they spake, their eyes slipped sideways to their neighbors' wives and their neighbors' fields and the altars far off. These they had desecrated. But the people knew where they were. They had not forgotten the rituals there, the gluttonous feast, the profusions of flesh. You won't do it, Joshua said. His eyes, though pale, saw far. And so this stone I set up will remember your broken promise. He dismissed the people and died, and all his generation with him. Then there came a new generation that knew not the Lord. Apostasy is swifter than ravens. Rebellion is a crop that does not fail. The people defected. They sought out Canaanite superstition and learned of the Baals. Asherah also they enshrined. Asherah, old and vile these are, even among rebel angels, and their worship is not songs. It is sacrifice and intercourse and murder. It is bloodletting and summoning and incantation. It is death itself and dust in the mouth. At last Yahweh relented. He gave the people what they chose. The angel himself went up from Gilgal to weeping, and Israel knew what that meant. Yahweh was leaving. The people did not want him. He would go. When he spoke to them, it was like God beholding Adam again. I brought you up from Egypt, he said, into the land I swore your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and ye shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. And truly, he had been faithful. The Lord had done all that he said. The people had not. What have you done? He asked. I will give you what you want. I will not drive out these people, nor their gods that you have chosen. They will be a snare on your neck, he said. They will choke you and rule you and squeeze out your life's breath, he lamented. Did you not know? Then he withdrew. Blood, 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 blood came afterward. Israel was oppressed by rebellious spirits and by the people that served them, and their sins were heavy. Often they cried out. Often God sent deliverers. These were strange men and women, some faithful, some less so. The judges. The most famous of these is a debaucher named for a demon, Shamash, and the most successful fails in the end. There was no king. Violence was everywhere. Israel was vile, dark as the civilizations of Tel El Hammam, even Sodom and Gomorrah, who knew demonic rituals so well they tried to force themselves on angels. Indeed, there was no king. End quote. So once again, that was a very lengthy excerpt from Blaine Eldridge's fantastic book, The Paradise King. That is one of the most powerful passages of any modern book I have ever read. And what it speaks to is the utter depravity of where we are in the story that we're going to be sort of walking through in these next few episodes here on Judges 9 and the story of Abimelech, who is the son of Gideon. Alex, what are your thoughts on that crazy passage? Wasn't that just wild?
I think I'm going to start incorporating it into bedtime reading for my kids before they go to sleep at night.
Listen, it's like it's like reading the I think I want to say I got this directly from the writer Blaine. I think he said this, but I think his point was to basically write like, what if the Bible was told as if it were the Lord of the Rings, basically, like if it was told in that sort of epic fantasy style. That's essentially what the Paradise King book is in general.
It's basically what it reminded me of, and it's a great it has a very literary kind of fictional tone to it, and like some type of fantastic feeling leading us into what we're going to be reading. So I think it's a very helpful supporting document to go along with what we're going to be speaking to.
Yeah, I totally agree. So we're in this place again. The context is the book of Judges. We're smack dab in the middle of this cycle that Israel is going through, where there just simply is no king. Everyone is doing what he deems right in his own eyes. There simply is no structure. There is no the presence of Yahweh, as we're going to see as we go through this, is greatly diminished. Some really interesting stuff about that. And so what I want to kind of set up here is this contrast between two kings. So the title of this series is called The Rise and Fall of the Bramble King. And so if this passage that I just read was setting up the story for the Paradise King, right? That's the Bible's story. The Bible is about Jesus, the Paradise King. It's about the rescue plan. It's about God himself. But what we're going to be talking about in this series is this comparison, really, between Christ and this other king. Okay, the Bramble King. And this king is nestled deep in a very, very dark story of Scripture, Judges 9. And this is the story of the king that Israel thought they wanted. And no, it isn't Saul. Again, most people don't realize this, but there was a king in Israel, technically speaking, before Saul. Okay, now I'm going to throw a big word out. This was the first non-monarchical king. Okay, so Saul was the first monarch that it was actually the established monarchy that God put in place. Okay, now of course we know that eventually God really wanted to place David over them, and so David actually became sort of the first, God approved, if you will, king. But he did at least give them Saul when they asked for a king. Okay, this time they took matters completely into their own hands. And so it's a little bit of a crazy thing. Most people don't realize there was a king in Israel technically before Saul, but he was a very destructive king, and God was nowhere in sight. So scholars agree pretty much that this story that we're going through tonight is the darkest expression of Israelite idolatry. So we've been talking about idolatry recently here on the podcast, right, Alex?
Yes.
In the context of the serving and worshiping the other gods, in the context of the divine council worldview. And what's so interesting about this passage is this is a Canaanized version of the Bible. There's no trace of Yahweh as God's covenant or as Israel's covenant God in this story. And the story is bathed in Baal worship. Okay. So a few things about that to kind of set the scene here. So as far as the Canaanite flavor of the passage. So first of all, there's no covenant name at all mentioned in the entire chapter. By the way, this is the longest chapter in the book of Judges. And Yahweh is not mentioned at all. Now, God, the God of the Hebrews, is in the story, but he's never named by his covenant name. He's named El. Okay, he's known by the name El. Now, many of you might know the term Elohim, right? So it's another way that we refer sometimes to capital G-O-D, God, although as we learned in some of our Divine Council series, Elohim can also just refer to any other being living in the spiritual realm. It doesn't necessarily have to refer to God. Okay, so in this case, the word El is used to refer to Israel's God. But here's two significant things about that. Okay, the first is that El was more of the generic name for God. It was not Yahweh. It was not the covenant name for God. But not only that, guess what the name in the Canaanite divine council of the Canaanite high creator God is? It's El. That's his personal name in the Canaanite divine council. Okay, so this is literally the worst case scenario. It's like this is the end of the story for Israel had there not been a rescue plan put in place. Okay, two more things on this. The second thing is the service of Baal Berith, depends on how you want to say it, how Anglo-Saxon you're feeling today, as to how you pronounce some of these names. Technically, Baal Berith would be how you'd say that. This is the God that they worship throughout this passage. And that terminology stands for the Lord of the covenant. So Baal means Lord, and then Berit is the covenant. So he's the Lord of the covenant. Some people like, so again, Baal, there was multiple Baals, right? There was multiple forms and expressions of Baal. And so one Baal was the Baal of the covenant, Lord of the covenant, Baal Berit. And so it's that's the what is mentioned as being worshipped throughout this passage. And then finally is the name of Gideon. So I always thought it was weird, right? Why, as we read through the Bible, does Gideon sometimes get called like the way that it was always pronounced growing up in the churches I've been in was Jerubbaal. Okay, it would technically be that's the funnest name to say. I just love saying the name, right? So I'm gonna probably go with Jerubbaal because it's what I'm used to, even though it sounds a little ridiculous. But the way that you would have said that in Hebrew is Yeru Baal. Okay, Yeru Baal, and it basically means let him contend with Baal. Okay, so Gideon's father, who was a Baal worshiper, named Gideon this, or changed his name to that when Gideon destroyed his father's Baal idol. Okay, and so let him contend with Baal is what that name Yerubbaal actually means. And so notice that as we go through this story, that Alex is going to has graciously volunteered to do the scripture reading on this time around. You're going to see the name of Gideon, but it's not Gideon, it's Yerubbaal. And again, it's another expression of the Canaanite flavor of the passage. So I've thrown a lot at you. We're gonna got one or two more things by way of sort of introduction before we move in here. But what are you thinking so far?
I'm thinking that we're in for a lot of fun names, and we're in for a very dark story. And I like a good dark story. Just setting aside what applications that we can get from this and the story into it. It's always um, it's always intrigued me getting into darker side of human actions, emotions, and the way of thinking, just to kind of see that total depravity side of human beings. So,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
this is I'm not gonna lie, this is one story that I've always looked over before. That's kind of the name of the game, it seems, for us, just looking over things that don't really make sense. You never think about Israel having a king beforehand. And now I know obviously it's not kind of what we think about. It didn't happen in the way that Saul was officially ordained the king by God himself, but it's just you just never think about this story.
No, it's true, and this is a really, really great example, and I feel like we just need to keep pointing this out. But it's why this podcast exists. Um, it's an easy story to look over, right? And here's the thing: all of the stuff that we're going to talk about, that like like even just this past Sunday at church, I was still getting comments from people about this message, not because I'm great or anything like that, just but because of how what we're going to see as we go through this is so like radical. To us it's radical, to us it's nerdy. For people in my church it was like, oh, I'm sure glad we have Steve to do the nerdy work of like studying this stuff, because I'm never going to do it. And I just can't stress to you how not just normal, but how immediate everything that we're talking about, that we have to do really hard work to get to, how immediate this knowledge and these insights would have been to the original audience of the text. That's how far separated we are in time, tradition, and translation. Everything we're talking about here would have been immediately obvious. And this is a really good point to talk about something, just a general principle that if you're a listener to this podcast 5 years from now, you're still going to hear this principle come up. So this is a really good place to introduce it. It's the literal versus the literary side. Okay. So, a couple things about this. A great example is what I opened with, reading that passage from Blaine Eldridge, talking about the story from Moses to David. And I didn't finish it. I purposely withheld that. At the end of the series, I'm going to go in and finish that excerpt to kind of show you something. But the point is that it's a literary retelling of the true events that really happened as it was written in the Bible. Okay. But it was told in such a way as to create a certain effect. What you need to understand is that the Bible itself is written that way. And this is why Dr. Michael Heiser used to say that it would be prudent to read the Bible in the same way that you're reading a fiction book. His point was not that the Bible is a fiction book or that what's in it is false. his point was that the readers are being or the writers, excuse me, are being intentional and trying to do something to you. And so if you read it as though it's a a fiction book, um, the writer is trying to do something to me as the reader, I need to look out for this, or I need to notice this, or I need to like take extra special care when I'm reading this section. Okay.
Hmm.
That's what we want to do here. And so everything in this passage reflects what literally happened. Okay. But the way the story is told literarily is for the purpose of capturing how dark Israel was. Okay. So, in other words, God is still mentioned, but he's mentioned by his name, by the generic name El. And he's mentioned polemically as kind of a shot against the Canaanites by assuming the name of the Canaanite high god in his council. Okay. Again, Gideon. Why not call him by the name Gideon? Well, because that is not the writer's forcefulness. The writer's point is that we're not worried about what Gideon would be called in Hebrew. We're not worried about his Hebrew name because this is a Canaanite passage. So we're going to call him Yerubbaal. We're going to call him by his Canaanite name. So it is a great example of what literally happened, but the way that the story is told is intentional to make you think a certain way about it.
Yeah, all interesting things, Steve.
All right, so here we go. I don't want to bury the lead anymore. So this is just for the practical application, because again, the point of this podcast is to talk about the nerdy stuff, but you know, there are some pastoral and practical points here to take away with you as well. So if you're listening and if you want to take notes, you can write this stuff down now so you don't forget it, or you can come back to it later. But here's 3 things. I'll give you the message in 3 quick bullet points. Okay. Number 1 is that idolatry is the root of all sin. Okay. Idolatry is the root of all sin. I thought this was interesting.
That's a good one.
Yeah. Why do we say that though? Like, okay, idolatry. What is idolatry? Idolatry is ultimately the substitution, of anything for God, right? Ultimately, yes. For the ancients, it was literally a worship of another god, right? And in this, we see these gods mentioned in this passage. Okay, as one example. But it's also interesting to me that Satan is not worshipped in the Bible. Now, there are like Satanist cults today, but think about it. I'm not sure of one example where Satan is actually being worshipped in the Bible. That's another one of those things that's kind of strange. Like when you think about it for 3 seconds, wait a minute. I thought Satan was the big baddie in the entire Bible. Why were they worshiping other gods? Right? Why weren't they worshiping Satan? Isn't that strange?
Yeah.
You ever thought about that?
I have thought about that, and I think one thing that I've just kind of thought of recently, I haven't fleshed it out fully, and I'm sure that I mean there's answers for it, but it I kind of and I almost kind of enjoy that in a way where I think a lot of people tend to not purposely but kind of elevate Satan as this, all powerful being, like the actual Satan we're talking about.
Yeah.
It and then but really when you kind of read through the Bible, he's just kind of like an afterthought. He's a description on how the story carries through,
Mm-hmm.
through the salvation plan, and like he's just he's just an aspect. He's just a part of the story. He's
Mm-hmm.
not the story. And so when you're thinking about it in that light, it makes more sense why you don't see more of him, or he's like frequently, at every single chapter. He's not the antagonist of the story. Honestly, the antagonist of the story is us as humans, and
Yeah.
it's being separated from Christ. So anyway, that's kind of my long
And,
answer to
and
your
yet we're the
question.
ones being redeemed, which is just part of what makes the
Yeah.
gospel
Yeah.
so beautiful. But here's why I can say this then. Like, okay, Satan isn't worshipped in the Bible. Idolatry is the root of all sin. Well, this is why Satan is actually not very focused. Like, yes, Satan is very prideful, of course, but Satan is not focused on you drawing your attention to him. Satan wins if you get your attention on anything
Mm.
that isn't God. And this is why I think idolatry is still something that we should and can talk about today, because idolatry, whether it's self idolatry or idolatry over our job, over money in general, idolatry over, frankly, our kids or our government, like there's lots of things that are good things that still can ultimately get in the way of what God wants to do. And all Satan has to do is get you focused on something that you think is good that isn't God. and substitute that thing for God, and his job is complete. So I think it's interesting that Satan doesn't actually have to get you to worship him in order for him to accomplish his goals. Okay.
Yeah,
And
100%.
so another manifestation of this leads to our second sort of practical point, right? So first point is idolatry is the root of all sin. Okay. Second practical point is that selfish ambition leads to destruction. So as we go through this story, keep in mind something. What we're basically witnessing here in this story throughout its conclusion is the tragic and logical example of a life lived for the self. Okay. This story is what happens if we get or if we got what we deserved instead of Christ. This is the story as if there was no rescue plan. It's kind of like a
Mm,
microcosmic
that's a
version.
good angle. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and it's what the story does. It's sort of a microcosmic version of the anti-gospel, right? This is somebody who sets himself up as king, thinks he's doing good, almost gets away with it, and then God destroys him at the very end in the most embarrassing way possible, which is just wild. Okay, so if there was no rescue plan, this is it. And this is where the story of Israel would have ended. I'd like to do, this is a mental note, but I think it'll be fun to, as a teaser. One of the podcasts, Alex, an idea that I have that I wrote down, I think that I'd like to do in the future is an episode on bottlenecks in the Bible. So if you're not familiar with the concept, not sure where it originates, if it's in science or sociology, but a bottleneck is basically an event where, like a population or something like that goes down to a singular, like, a very small point. Just imagine like a bottleneck in a bottle, right? And where you had more when you started, and then at the very end, only a few come out, right? So there are these bottlenecks in scripture where literally, like, had God not intervened, the story would have ended there. The flood is an example, right? The flood was a literal population bottleneck that without God's providence and sovereignty, the story wouldn't have continued. The supernatural creation of Israel as a people was a bottleneck. And this story, I believe it's a little bit of a less obvious one, but I believe this story is a bottleneck. If there was no
Mm.
rescue plan in place, this story shows exactly what would have happened if Israel had fully integrated into Canaanite theology and cultural practice and never had come out the other side. Isn't that crazy? This is the story would have ended here. That's really
It
sobering to
makes
think about.
makes you wonder when you think about kind of like modern day, if everyone just gave up, like what the story would look like if the Bible was written today. What would it look like if Americans just dumped God 100%?
Mhm.
What would we trade for that, and what would it look like?
Correct. Really, really abysmal, right? And
Yeah.
who's to say? I mean, who's to say it couldn't happen, again, where there's going to be some other kind of bottleneck where maybe like most churches end up descending into like progressive ideology or something. And then like there's only going to be a few left. And there is, I mean, I'm not the biggest on like end times stuff. Like I'm just not the most knowledgeable about it. I'm just being honest. But like, there is that idea they say of like a great falling away at the end, right? And you got to think, is that sort of another one of these bottleneck events? And then like the final bottleneck is just like, the final, I don't know a non cheesy way to say this, but like the final people who are actually saved, that are,
Mm.
gonna end up, with Christ. So who knows what is to come? All I know is that when you live for the selfish ambition, like Abimelech is actually going to put on display here for us, is what leads to destruction, and it will be so obvious as to not be able to miss it in this passage.
Mm.
Okay, and then the third point is hardly anything groundbreaking. In a sense, it's the most groundbreaking thing, but also it's an obvious point. The only rescue is the work of Christ. If there had not been a plan for Israel through the pathway of Jesus Christ, then ultimately the story would have ended, and there would be no rescue plan for us. And so we have Christ to lean on and to rely on. And without him, this is where we'd be in the story. So we can just read this story and feel really bad for Abimelech and for the people and the different characters in this story. And at the same time, we can praise God that we are not in their shoes, and that
Mm.
he's provided his work on the cross to rescue us. So those are the sort of practical application things to keep in mind as we move forward.
Awesome, Steve. I like that introduction.
All right.
Covers a lot of ground for some heavy stuff.
Indeed. Indeed. All right. Can you read Galatians 6, 7, and 8?
Galatians 6, 7, 8. Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. But he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting.
So when I preach this at church, I subtitled the message, God will not be mocked. And I looked up, this is another one of those verses, we know it. We grew up, like, we memorized it in like Awana and Kids Club and stuff like that growing up. Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever man sows, that shall he also reap. Okay. So I wanted to look up, because this is another one of those Bible verses we're just so familiar with. I wanted to look up the word mocked and see what it was. So in Greek, it's the word mikterizo. And it is indicative of the action of turning up one's nose, right? So it's like that idea of like when you turn up your nose to something. And I was like, okay. I mean, I kind of know what that means, but like honestly, not really. So let's see what Webster's has to say about it. So I looked up the idea of turning up your nose in Webster's, and I thought this was just crazy. Hit me like a ton of bricks. To refuse to take or accept something because it is not good enough, right? To refuse to take or accept something because it is not good enough. And so when you think about it that way, this is, again, the ultimate story of sowing and reaping. And it's this idea that, honestly, we're treating God as though he is not good enough. Israel treated God, despite his rescue, despite his covenant, despite his promise, despite his love that he showed over and over and over again, despite his patience, despite his grace, he was constantly turned down. Israel said, you are not good enough. I want to worship the Baals. I want to worship the Asherahs, right? I want to do this religion thing. I want to do spirituality on my own terms. And God said, no, I will not be mocked. It's not going to work. You have to do this my way. You don't get to say whether or not I'm good enough. I am good enough. The only reason you even exist as a people group is because I have allowed you to. And so, again, that just, I think, brings a interesting color to this message about the idea of sowing and reaping, God not being mocked. This is what happens to the man, to the person who tries to mock God, which is why the Bible is clear and consistent on this point, that the fool is the one who says in his heart, there is no God, right? The fool says in his heart, there is no God, because if God is real, if Jesus is the Savior, then the most foolish thing you could ever do is reject him. And the story that we're going to read here shows the end of the rejection, or shows what happens in that rejection. So it's time to finally read the Bible. All right. We are now to the point in the story where we need to pick up where at the end of Gideon's story before we move into Judges chapter 9. So I'm going to bring up the Bible here. And if you just want to start, Alex, if you want to do Judges 8, 30 to 35, would be a great starting point.
Before I do that, I want to say something about the mock definition.
Yeah.
I never looked at it before like that too, and it's an interesting definition, but it kind of makes sense. I know that Steve and I kind of talked before about making a mockery of sin and how foolish it is, and there's some sort of like justice feeling with it, I guess. But it makes sense when you look at it in light of that definition, to refuse to take or accept something because it is not good enough. And it makes perfect sense why you would mock a sinful lifestyle or just sin itself, because it's something that is not good enough. It's something
Mm-hmm.
that we shouldn't accept. And it's just I don't know, maybe it's just the play on words, but it kind of gives it a new kind of definition,
Yeah.
like a new
Well,
meaning.
yeah, and I like it too. Like, I've always thought that was funny, right? Because the way that in the modern day that we tend to use the word mocked, we think of it as like laughing, like, or like making fun of or something like that. And I was like, hang on, be not deceived. Like, we won't make fun of God. So whatsoever a man sows, that shall we also
Mm.
reap. And it was like, I don't understand. Like,
Yeah.
that doesn't seem to make sense. But when you look at the Greek word, it actually means turning up one's nose. And if turning up one's nose means to refuse to accept something because it's not good enough, then it's like, yeah, don't be deceived. Like, God is good enough. You're not going to get to stand there and say that God is not good enough for you. Whatever it is that you sow in place of accepting God, then that's what you're going to reap, right? Instead of reaping the blessings of God, essentially. So it makes sense when you actually look at the words. In order to know what the word means, you have to know what the words mean, right?
Yeah, 100%. All right, Steve. So Judges chapter 8 and 30 through 35.
Yeah, please.
And remember, Gideon is Yerubbaal. So that's who
Yeah,
we are talking about here. So Gideon had 70 sons, 70 sons. That's a lot of sons.
that's a
His
lot.
own offspring. Yes, since he had many wives. Well, that explains it. His concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, and he named him Abimelech. Then Gideon, son of Joash, died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abizarites. When Gideon died, the Israelites turned and prostituted themselves by worshiping the Baals and made Baal Berith their god. The Israelites did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them from the hand of the enemies around them. They did not show kindness to the house of Yerubbaal, that is, Gideon, for all the good he had done for Israel.
Okay. Right. So this is the end of Gideon's story. Gideon's story is a man, just an interesting one, multi-layered, goes through a few chapters, really
Mhm.
starts out on a high note, right? I mean, Gideon is doing a great work for the Lord. He's a little, doesn't have very much confidence, and he's like, all right, God, well, let's make sure that you're telling the truth here. So I'm going to ask it to rain, but you don't need to get any on the fleece. And God does that. And he's like, no, it's not really good enough. So how about you make it rain only on the fleece, right? And nowhere else. And
Right.
God's like, all right, fine, whatever, right? Um, so much bad theology on decision making as a result of that passage. Oh, just put out a fleece. Well,
Oh my goodness.
that's
Yes.
not how it works. But that's a different discussion. Okay. Um, but it's not how you start, it's how you finish, right? And in the case of Gideon, unfortunately, he did not finish well. So in in Judges chapter 7 and chapter 8, you have this sort of scenario that's kind of a weird story. The details are kind of hard for me to retell. It has to do with like bread and some other weird stuff. But basically, again, Gideon is, he delivered Israel through the hand of God from the Midianites, and Israel held him in high esteem for that. And they're like, "Hey, Gideon, we'd like to make you our king." And Gideon's like, "Well, here's the thing, guys. Thanks, but I don't really want to be your king. I'll tell you what, though. If you want to bring me like your gold and your jewelry and all this, I wouldn't mind that. And so I'll just make this golden ephod and, you know. So what's the point? The point is Gideon wanted to live like a king, right? He wanted the people to applaud him for his efforts. He wanted him to bring their gold and their silver and their jewelry and all of that stuff. But he didn't want the responsibilities of being a king. And you can go back and read that and kind of see all that happen in verse 22 and following of chapter 8. Go read that on your own sometime. But he didn't want to be a king. He just wanted to live like one. I thought the 70 sons thing is interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one, boy, I thought I had it bad with
I thought you did too, Steve.
three sons and one wife. Gideon had 70 sons and many wives. It doesn't even tell us how many. It just said he had many wives.
The too
How
many to
many
count. When
kids?
it says many wives, there's too many to list.
That's exactly right. It's like if you go to a website and they don't have a price available, it says call for quote. It's too expensive, right?
Yes,
So they just
absolutely.
they couldn't even give us a number of how many wives he had, and he had 70 sons. And then of course he also had a concubine with which he had another son. Now,
Mm.
this there's an interesting connection here. So the number 70 comes up quite a bit in the Bible, like many times. And so this is one of those ancient numbers that was probably what we call a royalized number. One reason why it's really significant in this passage, though, is because Baal also had 70 sons or 70 offspring. Okay. And so you have this interesting association going on where Gideon, the would be king, had the same number of sons as Baal in right Canaanite mythology, that they are within, in the midst of these people, and getting ready to, to essentially start worshiping one of the Baals. And so the likelihood that Gideon and Baal literally each had 70 sons is probably not very likely. So this is an example of what we think is basically a royalized number, okay? And significant here because of the Canaanite connections. And again, going back to the inerrancy thing, I guess there are some who would want to take this path, but in my view, this does not mean that the Bible is in error. What if Gideon had 73 sons? It's very possible that Gideon had 73 sons, and the Bible was essentially summarizing and royalizing this number 70 for the literary purpose of making it match with the offspring of Baal. Okay, so it's again, it'd be so easy for a skeptic to point at the Bible and see what's the likelihood that they both had 70. See, the Bible is wrong, it's making it up, and it's a lie. That's not how ancient writing worked. Again, there's the literal piece of it that happened, and then there is the royalizing that happened. Now, so to me, or I should have contrasted the literal thing that happened and then the literary style of how it's told. Now, I don't think this would mean that like Gideon actually had like 5 sons, right? But it's using the term 70 to match because that's not consistent with the rest of the story. Because again, the story kind of goes on to tell about how all these other sons have been slaughtered. So it's not as though that we can just say it's anything. This is where, in my opinion, the person who is trying to press too hard for the inerrancy case is going to struggle, right? Because it's like okay, it's not, or maybe I should say press too hard to say that the Bible is errant, because it's not like, okay, if he didn't have 70, therefore he had 5, and it's like way off. Like in my opinion, I'm pretty sure it would be accurate to say that the numbers were close, right? So maybe he had 65 sons or 73 sons or something like that, and it's rounded to 70 for that purpose. Does that make sense? Am I
Well,
making sense?
I think one of the like what you said, whether it's 70, 75, even like 58, 62, whatever it is. I mean, it says in verse 30, Gideon had 70 sons, his own offspring, since he had many wives. And so it just, no matter
Yep.
what, if it wouldn't have been for the wives, then maybe someone can make an argument for that. But it's saying like, hey, this guy had a lot of kids. He had a lot of wives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly right.
And this is why, Steve, you and I need to come up with our own definition of inerrancy
Exactly. I'm still convinced.
for the whole world to adopt.
Yeah, that's unlikely. Just to put it lightly. Yeah. Um okay, so here's something else. So again, at the very next a part of, well, actually, so in verse 31 we see that his concubine who was in Shechem, and I'll just pull up the Bible here again. Verse 31, you see there it says his concubine who was in Shechem also bore him a son and named him Abimelech. Okay. So Abimelech is two pretty common words in Hebrew put together, and they are fascinating words. So Abimelech, first you have Abba, right, which is father, and then you have Melech, which is king. So, so, so Gideon, who did not want to be a king but wanted to live like a king,
Yeah.
literally named his son, "My father is king."
Isn't that
Abimelech.
wild?
Yep, yep, yep.
Yep.
My father is king. And so again, you see it's like that verse that says like be sure your sin will find you out, right? I'm not exactly sure what that means. It's kind of a weirdly phrased thing. I'd want to maybe look at it in a couple other versions too. But like it seems like this idea, which I think is correct. Like I've heard Sean McDowell talk about it like a beach ball. It's like, you're whether you're hiding your sin or whether like whatever it is, you're hiding like your knowledge of God, even if you deny that God exists or whatever. But like every time you say "I love you" to your son, like you're acknowledging that you have this feeling called love that is not just a random, mixing of chemicals, bouncing around, but it's actually an emotional feeling by two rational beings that wouldn't be able to experience love if not for God. It's like when it's like you got a beach ball and you're playing in the ocean and you keep pushing the beach ball down, but then the beach ball keeps splashing up, right? Because you can't actually suppress the beach ball down. And so that's what I kind of see going on here, right? Is like, yeah, he says he doesn't want to be a king, but he literally names his son, "My father is king." So like there's the expression of it right there. Like it always comes out, your true motives, your true intent, and
Yeah.
what that actually breeds.
Yeah, it's a weird it's, I picture that Gideon was a it just sounds like an annoying guy to be around. Someone who
Right?
just I just picture someone like that who names his son that, like, just being in normal conversation with him saying like, "Hey, like, I know you said you didn't wanna be king, but why are you having all these people bring you, like, these earrings and stuff?"
Yeah,
And that he
yeah.
just outright like, maybe he would just deny it or something and say, "Oh, I don't care, I just suggested I like earrings." But,
I
like, isn't
yeah,
that kind of a stretch? "No, I just like earrings." Like, "Okay, okay,
yeah.
Gideon."
Right, right. He's a little whiny too, right? Like
Yeah.
with the whole fleece thing, and then like he's having a conversation with his dad, and like he destroys his dad's like Baal statue, and he's kind of like I don't know, he's kind of insecure, kind of flies off the handle, kind of like a little needy and a little whiny. And interesting, yeah.
Somewhere out there, if you listen closely, you can hear Gideon complaining that the streets of gold are not quite as golden as what he hoped they would be.
Oh, that's hilarious. And if he's like so many enlightened expositors of the Bible, he's determined that there actually weren't streets of gold at all. It was just symbols. So
Yes,
anyway,
yes,
mm, interesting.
yes.
Yeah.
He is
So
arguing that point now.
indeed, indeed. So we are about to move on, but the last thing I want to say, kind of about this first section, which by the way, I didn't even tell you the name of sort of this section or first point that I kind of outlined here, but I called this the Scourge of Idolatry, and I am a Baptist, so these are all alliterated. So I did that for y'all's benefit, but yeah, this is sort of the Scourge of Idolatry, right? So we sort of see here, and we're not even into chapter 9 yet. We're getting ready to go there, but you sort of see here that like the problems that idolatry is what has caused this epic sort of descent into chaos, right? And so the descent into chaos sort of begins with Gideon, and it's going to move further here into the story of Abimelech. And you can see, again, Gideon's pride on display. You can see the connections with Baal and the Canaanites. And let me tell you, the story gets a lot worse from here. So I just wanted to point out that the idolatry that we see in this passage, right? This is not like mere harlotry where it's like, um, Israel, like, like some people decide to like go off and start worshiping in the high places, and they might do an offering or, here or there and burn the incense to Baal or something like that. This is a displacement, and we see this in the language that's used. This whole passage reflects an entire displacement of Yahweh as their covenant God, which is like, again, when you understand, if you're just reading the words and skimming over it in your Bible study, and you read the words, Baal Barit or Baal Berith, like whatever, I'm sure that was just another Baal figure, whatever. When you find out that it means Lord of the Covenant, that has such a
Mm,
deeper meaning, because you're actually saying, oh my goodness, like these people replaced God,
it's an actual
replaced
replacing.
Yahweh, yeah,
Yeah.
with Baal. That's exactly the mindset of chapter 9. So, with that said, unless you have some comments there, which you are welcome to make, did you want to head into chapter 9?
Yeah, no, absolutely. All right. I do want to say that it's well worth reading the end of chapter 8 just to give it the context as we get into the story, or else I don't think there'd be a lot of confusion going into it. And the chapter separations can do a lot. I think they do more harm than good, because someone just picking it up might end at chapter 8, say like in their normal devotions or something, and then pick up chapter 9 the next day and totally forget about what they read the day before, and then just kind of space out on the timeline of things. But anywho, okay,
Absolutely.
verses what verses, Steve?
Oh, 1 through 6.
All right, 1 through 6. Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal, went to Shechem and spoke to his uncles and to his mother's whole clan, saying, "Please speak in the hearing of all the citizens of Shechem. Is it better for you that 70 men, all the sons of Jerubbaal, rule over you, or that one man rule over you? Remember that I am your own flesh and blood." His mother's relatives spoke all these words about him in the hearing of all the citizens of Shechem, and they were favorable to Abimelech, for they said, "He is our brother." So they gave him 70 pieces of silver from the temple of Baal Berith. Abimelech used it to hire worthless and reckless men, and they followed him. He went to his father's house in Ophrah and killed his 70 brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal, on top of a large stone. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, survived because he hid. Then all the citizens of Shechem and of Beth Millo gathered together and proceeded to make Abimelech king at the oak of the pillar in Shechem.
Okay. So Abimelech goes to his father's or his mother's family and says, "All right, look, here's the deal. Like, there's a lot of us, okay? And listen, dad didn't want to be king, but 70 sons, like, there's gonna be some fights for the throne. So here's the deal, people of Shechem. Do you want me, who is your kin, your family, to be ruling over you? Or would you prefer the other 70 ish sons of Gideon to be ruling over you? Because I am your flesh and blood. Do you want one man to rule over you, or all the other men of Yerubbaal to rule over you?" And they're like, "Well, after all, he is our brother. I mean, he's kind of got a point, you know?" So, what does he do? He goes out and he hires this ragtag dude brigade, okay? The King James says they are light and vain, okay? In the CSB that we just read, it's worthless and reckless, right? These guys are literally the bottom of the barrel. I just imagine Abimelech going to a bar, right?
Yeah.
In Shechem and saying, "All right, you guys will do." They're all half drunk and everything. And they're like, "Sure, we need a job." So check this out. I did the math on this and looked this up. The amount of money that these guys got. Now, remember, what they were being contracted for, they ended up, serving Abimelech in his quote unquote kingdom. But the first mission, their first job, was to go slay the sons of Jerubbaal. Okay. And so they were going to go to kill his 70 brothers in Ophrah. And he needed this ragtag dude brigade to go help him. So I did the math on this. The amount of money that he got from the temple of Baal Berit to actually be able to do this and hire these people was about $617. Okay. So, and even an adult male slave was worth like 50 shekels. He paid them like basically 1 shekel, like barely 1 shekel each. And like they had to go each kill. So they each got like, about a shekel to go kill one of Abimelech's brothers. So $617. These guys were like super cheap, bottom of the barrel, even paid less than an adult male slave, which is kind of interesting and sort of ridiculous. So right. So what happens is he hires these worthless and reckless men, which I think is just really funny. He hires them with illegitimate resources, right? Like he gets the money from the temple of the god that they're now serving, right? Their new covenant god. He goes to that place to get the money from his temple to go and to kill the other sons of Gideon. And so I think there's an interesting lesson there. The ends don't always justify the means, sort of thing. Like, it just because you want to go do a good thing doesn't mean that you borrow money from, and it's not a good thing, by the way. Like, it's not a good thing he did. But the point is that you shouldn't do it anyway, right? It's just a bad idea. One connection here that's sort of interesting. If you look at verse 6, it says, then all the citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo gathered together and proceeded to make Abimelech king at the oak of the pillar in Shechem. Okay. Just really, really tragic. Okay. Super tragic irony here. So this pillar is the same place that they crowned him king, was the same place where Joshua in Joshua chapter 24 made a covenant with the people that they would never go off and worship other gods, and instead would worship Yahweh. So again, I'll just read this, Joshua 24. This is in the KJV 25 and 26. So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day and set them a statute and an ordinance in Shechem. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God and took a great stone and set it up there under an oak that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. So it's the same place where Joshua made a covenant with the people and wrote it in the book of the law of God that they were going to worship and serve Yahweh. They would not go a whoring after other gods. They would certainly not trade their covenant God for another covenant God. And what's happening here? Abimelech, the false king, is using the money from the temple of the covenant God to go kill the sons of Gideon. And I look at this and I just think, what depravity
Mm.
have we descended into in this story? I mean, this is just really, really bad.
Yeah, I think that he must have been bullied quite a bit by his brothers growing up.
It's a good consideration. You got to think about that, right? Like, what would lead him to do this, right?
Yeah, it is kind of unfortunate. The storyteller in me wants to know like the whole backstory to, what brought him to this point. I mean, obviously, obviously there's some pretty messed up family situations there. Then you have
Oh yeah,
the Israelites turning away from God anyway. And so there's so many problems anyway. So he's obviously being brought up in an environment that's just chaotic. But then just to the shift to, he obviously has devised this plan on, wanting to become king. That's his desire. And then it almost, again, it doesn't give us a specific detail, but it's just kind of like it's a blink of an eye. Like, okay, now that I kind of have this support and I have this money, I'm just gonna go kill my brothers now. Um, it really kind of reminds me of just like, you hear about, someone who like goes on like a mass killing spree or something, just someone who, and you just think like that person just must not have a conscience of like the value of life or just any type of conceptualization of that. And that's was kind of what Abimelech reminds me of.
Yeah, yeah. I think ultimately he had a selfish ambition, like we talked about.
Mhm.
This whole section is what I call the sin of selfish ambition, and it's this again, it's this idea that like when you have an idea in your mind of what you want to do, like he wanted to serve and be the king over these people. And as we're going to see, a little teaser for next time, we're going to see this epic pronouncement made against him by the son of Gideon, Jotham or
Mm.
Yotam, who got away. And he's going to be like, look, like he's going to tell this epic parable that I'm not going to get into now. That's going to be like, yeah, like Abimelech, he might have thought he had a good idea, but turns out he's nothing but a bramble bush, nothing but a thorn bush, and all a thorn bush is good for is
Mm.
fire and burning and destruction. So, a reminder here on the practical side of things is that you don't have to fall into those patterns. God has given me and you agency, that we don't have to be like like our father was or like our grandfather was or whatever. Like we can actually break these patterns if we want to. And so he didn't have to be the same way as Gideon. He didn't have to live up to that name of my father is king, right? I mean, he could
Mm.
have just taken the double meaning, right? My father is king, Yahweh, right? Yahweh is my king. Yahweh is my father, right? He could have leaned into that instead, leaned into sort of that earthly, kingly, selfish ambition, wanted to take all the glory for himself, and then ended up in this position where um, the people were crowning him king, but it was under false pretense, and it was not the Lord's will. So I have this quote here that I want to read, and then we can sort of wrap up, and you can give me kind of any final comments. But this is from Dan Block. He's a really well known and a really prolific Bible scholar. He said this quote: "Those who are called to leadership in the kingdom of God face constant temptation to exchange the divine agenda for personal ambition. Ironically, the more impressive one's achievements for God, the greater the temptation." Having won
Mm.
deliverance for his people with a spectacular victory over the Midianites, Gideon began to act like it had all been achieved with the sword of Gideon rather than the sword of the Lord. "Before long, thy kingdom come" was replaced with "my kingdom come." Heedless of Deuteronomy 17:14 through 20, the servant of the people had become their despot. Unfortunately, the old adage, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, often holds true even in the church. End quote. And so I thought that was really appropriate. Of course, he was talking about Gideon, but like clear to see that Abimelech is going to follow in his path. And really, um, like if you just compare the timid, fearful, unsure Gideon of chapter 6, the beginning of chapter 6 in Judges, to the uh, corrupt and just uh, destructive Abimelech, Gideon's son, like it's crazy to think in one generation how bad things can
Mhm.
get. And of course, we're going to see his end is absolutely terrible. But the story of Gideon could have turned out completely different. But selfish ambition got in the way, and pride tends to do that. So,
I like that quote. I forget the specific wording, but it kind of says, with great power comes great responsibility almost, but with great power comes great temptation. It's kind of a way that
mm,
flips on it. And I think you and I have talked about this before, Steve. I don't know why it just popped in my head, but I think about like preachers today, not even necessarily what I would say like famous ones, but just any kind of preacher who has a wide audience, whether it's a large church or goes and speaks around a lot. And you and I always kind of have a pet peeve of seeing people ask preachers to like sign their Bible. And I don't know why,
mm-hmm.
but I just kind of thought like, does that do you think that would help or hinder the person signing the Bible? Like it just
Yep.
someone's already in that position where maybe they're a great speaker, eloquent, and just they're naturally liked. And maybe they don't necessarily struggle with, like pridefulness or anything like that. But I would just think that, anyway, that's just one very specific, example of it. But
Yeah.
I could just see how being in that type of position, even if your heart is right and you want to do the right thing, it could be very easy to get comfortable and cozy with a position like that, where people like you, you feel like you're doing good work, and then you get sucked into temptation quite quickly.
That is literally like the most fantastic point. Like I remember growing up thinking, yeah, I mean, it was normal at the time, but like as I sort of,
Yeah.
started to grow out of it a little bit, I was like, it's kind of weird that like I have these pastors like with all their signatures in my Bible, and like I used to like idolize them, and I'm just like, well, that seems wrong. Like that wasn't good,
Seems odd. Yeah.
It's like I should care that the word of God's preached, not like how good of a storyteller this guy is, or like his hair is really nice, or like he can memorize lots of scripture, like
Mm,
or he's really eloquent. Like those are not the things. Like those are the kind of things that can lead to corruption. And
mm.
sure, a lot of those guys are fine and dandy and nice guys, and I'm sure for some of them it was just fine. They could sign people's Bibles with
Yeah.
no issue and not have a problem. For others, I guarantee you it went through their heads. Right,
Mm,
the man of God is somebody special. He's up on a pedestal, and he's going to sign the back of my Bible, and I think that's not that's not how the Lord sort of intends for it to be. Um, and so I think, yeah, for real, in the church, we see lots of temptation and struggle and corruption of power when one person becomes, starts to think of themselves higher than they ought to. And if
mm,
only there was a passage in a book that said that we should not think of ourselves higher than we ought to, because the minute that we do
mm.
that, we're going to fall and be humbled really, really quick. Well, if we would take
Not only that, not only a book that says it, but a book that's filled with examples of it happening.
examples, lots of
Yeah.
examples, many. And this, again, as we go through the story, is going to get much worse. So I think we cut it off here. Next time, what
Yeah.
we're going to get into is Jotham's solemn pronouncement over Abimelech and the people of Shechem. And it's a really interesting piece of literature that I think you're going to be like, holy cow, this is really amazing. But it's sad. But also cool, and I'm glad God put it in the Bible for us to learn and discover. So, any final comments, Alex?
No, I just want to thank you for bringing this topic up and bringing it to light. I'm loving it so far. It's a very good story.
It's cool, and it only gets worse and better from here. So,
Worse and better. Yes. All right, Steve.
all right. Well, hey, look, if you find this podcast useful and helpful, please, if you're on YouTube, comment, like it. If you're on a podcast, hey, leave us a review. We could really use some
Mm,
podcast reviews so that when people come across the podcast, they see other people that have liked it, liking it and engaging with it. So, if you're a listener on audio, like take just a minute to go to wherever you're listening and see if there's a review, a place you can leave a review. Go to iTunes and you can do that, and we'd be really grateful for it. And beyond that, we'll see you next time on My Strange Bible.
See you next time.